about stories, off and on. And once upon a time, I wanted to write a story. I love to write. And I wanted to write a story that started with once upon a time. Yeah, I love those old-fashioned fairy tales. And I figured it out because I thought about it. I think the reason that I love them so much is because when I was in school growing up, I don't know why, but I always felt really different from all the other kids. And I'm kind of curious, how many people here ever felt really a little or even a lot different from everybody else? Yeah, me too. So, put your hands down. So I wanted to write a story about someone who really was very different. I needed a few things to get started. The first thing I needed was my glasses, and y'all look really good, by the way. And I also needed my wicked, powerful laptop computer. And of course, I needed my imagination. Okay, that's a little scary. And I sat down one day to write this story that started with...
Once upon a time, in a small, bright village, at the foot of a large, dark mountain, a little girl was born. And when this child cried, instead of crying tears, she cried diamonds. And as a baby, she cried a lot, like all babies do. And so this village was filled with these beautiful, sparkling gems that kept tumbling out of her big brown eyes. Now, there wasn't anything really to buy in this village because there was always enough of everything to go around. And so all of the people were more than willing to share the diamonds. They didn't care. They would just use them for decoration around the town. In fact, they would hang them up in the trees. And then when the sun shone through the diamonds, they would cast rainbows into the streets. And then all the cats and the children run around playing games trying to catch the rainbows. Plus, some people would hang them up in their kitchen windows. And then, when the rainbows danced about on the stove, everything just seemed to taste better. Now, all of the ladies in this village, they all wore the diamonds in their hair. All of the men wore the diamonds on their boots. And all of the children had diamond buttons on their jackets. And all of the townspeople were very proud of this little girl. They all loved her very much. And because they loved her so much, she was very happy. And because she was so happy, and because she was growing up, she hardly cried at all. But everybody agreed really that it was better that way.
So when you're writing, do you ever get stuck?
Yes.
I got stuck right here. Best thing to do, I figured out, best thing, keep writing. Just keep writing. You can go back and edit. And maybe try something a little different. I decided to try this.
Now, stories are strange creatures. And this one that I'm writing is no exception. Stories have mouths to talk with. They also have feet, because they like to travel. The only thing is, stories don't know where they're going. They have no sense of direction. And one day, this story left the small, bright village at the foot of the large, dark mountain, and it began to wander. And it wandered over hills and through valleys, and it crossed fields and rivers, and everywhere it went, the story of the girl who cried diamonds told itself to everybody that it met along the way. I mean, people would stop, and they would listen, and then they would smile, because everybody agreed it was a very lovely story. Then after the people had heard the story, they would go along on their way, and the story would wander along on its way until one day, this story wandered into a hard, gray place where nobody seemed to listen at all. I mean, everybody just rushed right past the story. Nobody paid any attention to it at all, because the story had wandered into the big city. And it sat down there on a street corner, and it tried to cheer itself up by telling itself to itself.
Cool idea.
That's when a strange man came walking down the sidewalk. He was all stooped over. He was looking at the ground, and his eyes were dashing back and forth. He looked like a nervous little animal. And he was looking for anything shiny, like little bits of foil, little pieces of shiny paper, little bits of metal, anything at all that looked like money, because he was a greedy man, and all he wanted was to be rich. And as he scurried along there, he reached down to pick up a little silver piece of paper when he heard the faint whisper of the story of the girl who cried diamonds. And he stopped. And he listened very hard. And he was very interested indeed. That man scooped up that story right off of the sidewalk, one word at a time, put the whole story in his pocket. That night, the greedy man rode the train all the way out to the small, bright village at the foot of the large, dark mountain. He arrived there just before dawn, and then he stole all the diamonds that he could put into his pockets.
Now, everyone knows that when you write a story, it has to have a problem. But when you write one of these old-fashioned fairy tales, you have to think of something really, really horrible. So I did.
And then he snuck into the little girl's house, and he stole her out of her bed, and he carried her back to the big city. Then all the way back to the big city, that girl cried and cried and cried, and all the way back to the big city, that greedy man just laughed and laughed and laughed as he caught those beautiful sparkling gems that kept tumbling out of her big brown eyes. Now when they got to the city, that greedy man locked the little girl up in a dusty little room, high up in a stone building. And there she kept on crying diamonds. She cried like never before. And the more she cried, the richer that greedy man became. Until one day, that greedy man became the richest person in the world. But greed is never satisfied. He just wanted more. And so the next day, he released the little girl from the dusty little room high up in the stone building, and he carried her out to the circus outside of the city, and he put her in a cage. I mean, right there in between the bearded lady and the five-legged pig. And then people came from miles around, and they paid money to that man, just so that they could stare at that little girl in her cage. And she just kept on crying diamonds, and she was very, very unhappy.
Okay. The hardest part, I think, when you're writing a story is that after you think of something really, really, really horrible, then you have to try to imagine some way to make the horrible thing stop happening. I thought this might help.
Now, in that circus, there was a clown. And he was not just an ordinary clown. He was a wonderful clown. And he always made everybody laugh. And that's what made him happy. But one warm, starry evening after the show, something was terribly wrong. Because all night, the clown, he had stood on his hands, he had turned his backflips, pulled flowers out of his hat, done his best pirouettes. Nobody laughed. Nobody even smiled, not even the children. And that clown knew that all of those children were trying to cry diamonds. Just like that little girl that he had seen in the cage over there between the bearded lady and the five-legged pig. Well, that clown was very upset. He didn't know what to do for his circus. But what he decided to do was to go and talk with the little girl. And so he slipped into the tent of all the strange attractions, and he climbed right up into that little girl's cage. And when that little girl saw that clown's face, she almost smiled. And that's when the clown knew that if only this little girl would smile, everything would be all better. So he sat down there and he talked with her. And that little girl told the clown all about the small, bright village at the foot of the large, dark mountain. All about the diamonds hanging from the trees and the rainbows in the streets. How everything just seemed to taste better. And she also told him about that wicked man that stole her out of her bed and carried her back to the big city. And as he listened, that clown, he just shook his head. And he looked at that little girl with such kindness in his eyes that it made her start to cry. And when that little girl started to cry, then that clown smiled. And then he reached out and caught one of those diamonds as it fell out of her eye. And then he caught another one, and then another. And then that clown tossed one of those diamonds up in the air. And then another one. and then another. The clown began to juggle those diamonds up over his head. And as those beautiful gems were just glimmering and glistening in the moonlight, he noticed the little girl started to smile. So he kept on, faster and higher and faster and higher. And those diamonds went way up over his head, came down behind his back, and he caught them with his feet, and he threw them back up with his feet. And they went way over his head and down. One by one they came, and he balanced them up on his nose. And when he did that, he heard the little girl start to laugh. So he caught those diamonds, and he sat down with her, and the two of them just laughed and laughed and laughed together for the longest time, until the girl noticed that the clown was staring at her with a look of wonder. And then very slowly, that clown reached out, and he touched that little girl on her cheek, and there was a warm, wet tear. It was made of water and salt, just like yours and mine. And it was from that day until the end of time that that little girl never cried diamonds again. Wait, that's not quite the end. You got to hear. Don't you want to know what happens at the end? That clown went and released that bearded lady from her cage, and she ran off to get a manicure. And he also freed that five-legged pig from his cage, and that little animal took off as fast as his 5 little legs would carry him. You don't know what happened to that wicked man? Susana wrote this story, and when I first heard the story, she didn't have any mention of the wicked man at the end. And you know, you're supposed to tie up your loose ends.
I didn't leave it out on purpose. I just couldn't think of anything that I liked that really worked. And so you probably have an idea, right? And I couldn't think of anything, and I cheated a little bit. I wrote, the end. Yeah, not okay. You can't do that. Luckily for me, one day Timmy was telling this story to a group of kids, and there was a girl in the 4th grade. She raised her hand. She said, well, I think I know what happened. And he said, what? She said, I think that when that little girl cried her first real tear, suddenly all of the diamonds that the wicked man stole turned into water and salt, and everything he owned got soaking wet.
Is that not perfect for that?
It's a great idea. So if you ever get really, really badly stuck, don't be afraid to ask for help. There's so many great ideas out there. You can help us with the end of the story. It's a fairy tale. You know how it's going to end.
Later that evening, that clown and that little girl made their way back to that small, bright village at the foot of the large, dark mountain, where they both lived happily ever after. That's the story of the girl who cried diamonds by Susana Abell.